I get in such a disarray up here sometimes. All right. Notes for later. Okay. All right, our scripture this morning is pretty short. It's only 3 verses, 2 verses, 3 total. James 1, 13 through 15. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away from their own by their own evil desires and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin then, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. That went smoothly, didn't it? All right. I thought it'd be better if that's short. I read it. Oh, well. I found a little story that I look at all kinds of places for little stories that catch my eye, and found a little story. It says a man he decided his clothes had started shrinking, and he decided, well, I better have a little diet. I don't want to buy new clothes. And so he started his diet, and he didn't feel like he was doing very well. But it was Saturday morning was coming up, and he decided, I've got to run into town. And he realized in the back of his mind, he says, my favorite donut shop is on the way to where I'm headed. A cup of coffee and a donut would really hit the spot this morning. So he decided, I got this diet. So he decided that he should pray about it. And so he prayed that if God wanted to have a donut and a nice, fresh, hot cup of coffee, that there would be a parking space that was open right in front of the actual shop. And so it was like, okay. And so it says in the little story, and then the man says, and it was amazing. On his 7th trip around the building, he found a parking spot right in front. We're here again in James. In fact, I went verses before what we did last week. And today we're talking about another subject that's a little bit tense on us sometimes, and that's temptation. And temptation, it may be a problem that just I have, or maybe one or two of you would admit to it. I know we don't like to admit for temptation in our life, but it's usually there for me anyway. And it doesn't have to be a donut shop. In fact, if I'm in the car, I have no trouble passing by a donut shop. Although I know there are some people that if they go by Krispy Kreme downtown and that red sign is on that says, hot, I don't know, what is it? I wrote it down somewhere. Hot now button. It's in the window, and I know people that will turn and get in the drive-through window. So that means that, first thing, I sort of think they were looking for it. Because it's not like it's on the big sign. It's in the window. So you got to turn your head a little bit. So, maybe they're tempted even before they're tempted. I'm not sure. But I know that luckily that doesn't tempt me. I don't. Well, okay, if I'm in a meeting and Krispy Kreme donuts are on the table, I'm tempted, okay? But that sign doesn't do it for me, and I don't really get in their line on my own. Maybe I'm just cheap. That may be too. I don't know. There's certain things that God gives you so that you don't, you can respond to temptations differently. So in this case, we're starting on this, trying to understand temptation. And there are several things that as we read that, if I had done a smoother job, you might have been able to grasp a little easier. The idea is that we do have some things that probably pop up, and everybody has a little different set of temptations that are, let's just say, hard for us. And everybody can probably, I won't ask you to name anything, in your mind you can probably think of, that hot coffee, or it might not even be a sinful thing. We have a lot of temptations on things that wouldn't be considered sin. It might not be good for you, but it wouldn't necessarily be considered sin. But James is not talking about the temptations for that, special cup of coffee or something like that, unless it somehow affects us spiritually. So in this case, he doesn't get into it, but men are tempted a little differently than women, and even though people say the sexes are supposed to be identical, men are a little more visually oriented and women are a little more emotionally oriented, and I'm not saying that's bad. That's why God makes us special and puts us together. But even people of the same gender have temptations that are different from each other and different levels of worry over responding to some of those. And we're not just talking about sexual here. He doesn't talk about the type of sin that this kind of temptation leads to. He's talking about the fact that we start with a temptation and go through this path that is that's bad for us spiritually. So as we look at this, according to James, it's not if you're going to be tempted, it is when. He actually starts with when tempted. And he does the same thing if you read the beginning of the chapter, with when you are in trials. So there are events in our lives that we don't like to consider. Trials and temptations are each one of those. And as a maturing Christian, we have to figure out, and today we're talking about trying to figure out at least a hint of the way we would deal with temptation in our lives. And I think the first thing we have to figure out from James is where temptation comes from us. And James points out a few things that we need to understand. And sometimes it's the things we want that we need to resist the temptation to shortcut or to do as we go through our Christian walk. Some of them are just not good for us, and some of us are not good for us because they turn into sin. So he gives 3 quick categories, and he doesn't really nail them down directly. You have to read that set of scripture to go, okay, I see where Tom got that. And I'm going to tell you the first one that I think he gives us is the source of temptation. The second is the power of temptation. And the third is the destination that temptation leads you in. So I mentioned last week, I consider James to be just the facts kind of guy. He doesn't do a lot of direct embellishment. And so as he's identifying the source of temptation, he starts first by eliminating sources. First, he says you can't blame God. God is not the source of temptation. He tells you why. God does not give in to temptation. You can't do something make God tempted to smite you. Okay, so God is not tempted, and therefore God does not use temptation to lead you into sin. So just understand that it's somewhere else. And then if you read through this, now eventually if you go through James, you're going to find where he does talk about the devil. He doesn't mention in this section anything about the devil. When he's talking about where does temptation come from, it's not the devil. Now, a lot of things we like to blame temptation on. Opportunities pop up. Now, those may come from the devil, but the temptation itself is something else totally. When we struggle with temptation, we have to acknowledge that the source, and the way he defines it, is the source is within us. Whatever you're tempted in, whatever it is that gets you, you already know how you would be better tempted. If I go into the donut shop, I'm more likely to buy a donut than if I just drive by. Okay, there's variables that we know, and sometimes we'll say, well, I just want to go look. I'll buy one for my friend. Or, some other thing, I'll go in and buy one and you leave with a dozen. And I'm using donuts because it's safer than other things that we might throw out there. We want something. We want what we want, is the way I guess I'd start that. And sometimes we want the donut and the light, that innocent light that comes on that says, hot donuts. It's something that just gives us the excuse to take temptation from just glancing to being, boy, I really want one now, because I know it's going to be warm and it's going to be, man, it's just going to be so good. When we struggle with temptation and with sin, we often play a blaming game. You think about it, sometimes we blame the hot, fresh sign. Oh, I wouldn't have got these donuts if that light hadn't been on. So we might do that, but also we sometimes blame family or friends or somebody bad in our history or some event that happened to us that make us so we respond to events or could respond to events in certain ways that at some point we might feel guilty about it because we went over the top. Some people have big anger issues. Some people, it's something else they might choose to do, or it might be the way we treat people, or judgment, or gossip. It could be anything that crosses a line into the sin category. So we're tempted to speak our mind, or we're tempted to do some event that we determine, maybe even to ourselves, that it wasn't right to do it, and that becomes something that may be sin in our lives. And it goes further back. We also know that we blame God, don't we? Well, God made me this way, so that's the way I am. And then we sort of discount the fact. We also sometimes we'll say maybe a safer choice is to blame the devil. and I guess that would be safer because we'd feel like, well, we're blaming the evil one for it. But what happens with James is he tells us that it's really our temptation comes from our own somewhat hidden desires that we allow to pop up, or something surprises us and the temptation pops up. It may not even be we made the initial choice. The temptation appeared because something set us off. Something happened. But you go all the way back to blaming God and other people. I thought, this has been going on, and you can find it all the way back in Genesis, where Adam and Eve are confronted about their choice of defying God and as we say, they bite the apple or eat the apple, and when Adam is confronted, God says, "What have you done?" And he says, "The woman you gave it to me, and I ate it." No, wait a minute, didn't that blame God? And then when she's confronted, she says, "Well, the serpent did it." So neither one of them stood up and said, "I was wrong. I shouldn't have done that." Neither one of them confront the fact that they made a choice that probably should have been pretty clear to them that they were disobeying God and they shouldn't have done it. So I'm not sure that we're any different today than even back in Adam and Eve's day. I guess the way that might put it simpler is when we have a problem with temptation and it just seems to be there all the time, or it might even change to a bunch of different things, or it might even lead us that where we take the next step and it crosses into a sin, then those are times when we have to acknowledge that it's not somebody else or something else that's really the problem. That is something that's within us, the original sin that's within us, that faith helps us to counteract, especially if we lean on it. But if we just try to deal with these things ourselves, then we'll normally lose. People used to talk about willpower for smoking cigarettes, and I knew my dad quit over and over and over again. And eventually he was successful. I can't tell you all the things he did or what worked. I just know that every time he tried to quit cigarettes, my life became less enjoyable. Same is true with my mom in a little different way. But they both quit, and they're both better for themselves because they were able to, probably more with willpower or maybe some medical help, they were able to accomplish that goal for their betterment. And that's what happens when we fight temptation, is when we're able to be successful, even with Jesus' help, even with God's change of something in our lives, that is when our life becomes better. So, it's easy to think that temptation is just sort of an enemy that's hiding in there, that evilness in us that pops out. But the real thing that bothers me is, I know what tempts me more than anybody else, really. I know that those donuts are there, and I know I can respond to that or not respond to that. There are things that it's easy to say, well, okay, I know it, and that's the reason I think temptation really is temptation. It puts us right on an edge of crossing that line between, well, it isn't that bad of a sin, it's something that's only me, we make some choices. So the idea that we can be attracted to the perfect bait because we already know that we've been fighting the battle on some subject or some action. So the second thing that we need to acknowledge that James gives us a hint of is he describes this idea of the sin that's within us as being powerful. Sort of says as you give into it and it drags you away. And again, that's the power of this secret that you're keeping, is the way to put it, because most of us don't express all the things that we consider temptations, and that it has a power over us. It doesn't have to have a loud voice if it's already in your head. So it doesn't have to be shouting in your ear to be powerful. It just has to be there, especially whenever something might give you an insight into, there's an opportunity there for something that I consider a problem in my Christian walk. If I choose to do that, I've messed up, and I'll have to go to God again and again and again. I think of that little voice as being like when my kids, and we would go to Walmart or some store, and the kids are going, I want a toy, I want a toy, I want a toy, I want a toy, or I want a candy bar, give me gum. And then a couple things happen. Either you stop and do sort of let's say a disciplinary correction, not that I would have ever done that, or Or you go, okay, fine, don't open it now, we'll get it after the cash register, and just shut them up. When we're responding to temptation, the way you shut up a temptation is that you turn around and say, okay, I'll do it. That's when it moved to that next step. It didn't have to be loud. It's just there. It's an internal struggle. I don't know, there's this internal struggle that what happens is we start making things acceptable. Because I'll tell you, temptation doesn't necessarily hit you on the big things. It's the little things and giving into this and giving into that. It comes along the way. And I think that these little things are bigger sins, because we'll get that. But the idea is that we give in so we can shut the voice up for a period of time. And plus, it really doesn't hurt anybody else most of the time, but it's setting a precedent of letting that little voice of evil, of temptation win. And it becomes easier to let it win again. Especially on some of the same topics. Maybe just a bigger view. Well, okay, I'll send this mean email right now, and then later on it turns into, your bigger gossip thing instead of being something in writing. It just grows where the first one might have been small and the language was soft, but then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger depending on what it is. And it's easier and easier to just give into that voice because we feel better when we first do it. Sometimes it's not long till we feel worse, but that's a whole other story. Temptation comes and it gives you this starting point. And I guess, not every temptation is automatically sin. There is a point of decision. There is a point of making a choice. I don't know, I haven't seen one in a long time, but I remember seeing the ads on TV for Sports Illustrated. They would come out with a bathing suit edition, right? And all the guys seemed to want that thing because they had evidently some really great articles about their sports teams in that issue. But in my case, if I went to the barber shop and one was laying in the seat next to me and I picked it up and started flipping through it, I don't care a thing about sports. But at some point, maybe I thought maybe there's something interesting, but at some point I'm going to come across a photo of a person that is probably less bathing suit to admire than someone ready to take a bath. At that point, I'm at a decision point. Some people say, just glancing. See, you can't stop what you see sometimes. You open the book, there's the picture, you see it. Now you have the choice. In my case, I probably would have turned bright red sitting there in the barbershop, and I would have slammed it shut, and they'd probably laugh because they would. Anyway. But we have the decision point of saying, I'm going to make another choice. Here I'm looking at glancing at a picture, and it's okay, I think, in my mind that you look and say, oh, there's a lovely, really young lady. But it's the lingering and deciding or thinking other things. Maybe, well, what if I had a girlfriend like that? Or crossing an edge might be, at some point, might become sin. And I'm not sure exactly what that point is. Maybe as you think, there are other people that I could have a relationship with because not everybody likes all this. Okay, so it's like, okay, so it's not really an automatic thing for me to worry about that, but there are still temptations that we look at and think, well, it's not that harmful. The girls are wearing clothes, sort of. So at some point, even that, though, could become a problem with somebody's Christian walk. The power of sin is so strong because it starts in the mind. We think about the sin. We play with it in our minds. Sometimes we're trying to find, maybe we're saying, well, I'm going to figure out a way out of it, but usually we're actually planning how we would engage the action. I've got my own list of sins. I don't know how some of the biggies that we might say are worse. Sin's sin, so it really doesn't matter. But usually I don't make the choice. Okay, it's usually not a total surprise if I make a choice. I was already thinking of it, and I do something selfish for myself, and so then it's like, and then I think, well, why did I do that? Or because I know I get guilty real quick, and I'll tell you, I think that's good, and that's not that I think God gives that instant guilt, but it's how I can recover. I don't. It's the point is, I guess, that we have to be thoughtful of when we are on the edge of taking an action that will convert it, a temptation into that's important because we're nagging us and less thinking about it when we're making the choice, and it becomes sometimes too easy to make that choice. So the third point that James had was that there's a direction that goes in this path, the sinful choices. Let me just paraphrase a little bit of 14, a little bit, and the rest is verse 15. Temptation becomes a desire, and that desire becomes a conception. In other words, a plan. And then that conception, I'm still using their words in mind, that plan gives birth to sin, and then sin, when it's full grown, brings death. Sin is not an action or something that we do in our lives that stays still. It flows. It's not a pond that can't get anywhere, won't affect other parts of your life. Sin is something that affects your whole life. And while you may or may not want to admit that you have sinned, you do. Maybe they're not as broad and big as you might have had in the past. Maybe God has helped you with some things. But it's not age dependent to be able to take a temptation and let it turn into something that is sinful and life-changing in a negative way. I sort of see sin as being sort of like the flowing stream. It's always coming by, and you're knee-deep, or maybe ankle-deep, and you move to knee-deep. And over time, though, you're heading in the path. The sin takes you in a direction, and the way he put it is, it goes through these steps, and it eventually comes to the point of death. That's a big end. Now, I don't think anybody's surprised that one day we'll die. It's just we'd like to make that choice. We actually have a fork in the road somewhere along the way that is, life is one way, death is the other way. And I'll tell you, it's a little fuzzy because you can make wrong decisions and still be on the path to life. Change your path, get corrected. But once you start giving in to sin and it becomes easier and easier to justify and say, well, that's okay, it's only me, nobody has to be hurt by this, then you're going to be on the path that goes the wrong direction because you stop at some point asking for forgiveness for the things you justify that you do. Not everything we do that was tempted is a sin. But the more we give in to the things that used to bother us, that don't bother us anymore, the more likely we're at the fork in the road and maybe started in the wrong direction. I don't know, maybe another way to put it. I've seen these news stories where there's a little leak in the dam. And I don't know if you realize it, but they get really excited if there's a leak in the dam. Because the little leak is quickly going to turn into a bigger leak and a bigger leak and a bigger leak until if they don't stop it, if they don't stop the water coming from one side, the water coming out the other side will suddenly empty the pond. If we have these sins in our lives that started out as a little trickle, they will grow and crack. They will make the hole bigger, and that flow will eventually, if we don't correct, destroy our lives. Now, it may not be as bad as all that for a long time, because sometimes you don't have to notice that there's a leak. You don't have to fix the leak. Temptation starts out with a promise that it'll make you feel better if you do this. It doesn't ever tell you really the truth. It doesn't say, would you like to destroy your life now, or you want to wait a little while? It doesn't tell you, this might ruin some of your friendships. It might do all kinds of things in your life. What it says is, hey, this is not a problem. Give it a try. Or, hey, it'll make you feel good. You can do that. That's not a big deal. God wants you to be happy. Temptation is something that becomes easier and easier to accept because it does not tell you the truth about the end of the journey. The death is the end, according to James, fact man. We have the option here of thinking about it is if we take the bait, that we know how to throw out and receive it. It looks great to us because we understand what we like. If we take that bait, well, we get caught into that stream that we don't know how to get out of eventually. I hope that you realize that as we start this process, what really I hope you learn from James is he says, you got these problems, First of all, you are the problem. Secondly, this problem has a lot of power. And third, you need to know where it's going to head if you follow it. It's not just that the sign is on, it's when we don't even pay attention to whether it's on or not anymore to make the same choice. So we have the ability to make a choice of life instead of death, and we can even change the path anytime we come to a realization or awaken somehow. But if we've taken the bait, we're going to be on the wrong path for a while. We have the ability to choose life. We have the ability to use that source of temptation to let us say, I think I need to think more about these things. Maybe we have to take things we know would be tempting to us and avoid them. Certain TV shows, not healthy for me to watch. Some of them I think they're dumb, which may be a sin in itself to say this is really dumb. But the same may be true. Maybe there's certain movies we shouldn't watch. Maybe there's some of those reality shows where they're always yakking at each other and getting back at each other, and that just feeds into our temptation to do that kind of thing. I don't know what the temptation would be, but there may be things that you choose before you get on the road to avoid the red neon sign, and that you make other choices. The quickest way to deal with temptation, and the one that is not high-tech, is that if you read the other places in the Scripture, is when you're tempted to flee. You don't take that road. If you find some temptation, you turn and go the other way. It's not that we have we can't do it ourselves, is what I'm really saying, I guess. We can't just accomplish it. And I hope that we always lean on Jesus and we look for direction and correction. And don't ever think that you've disqualified yourself from going back and asking for forgiveness, even if it's the 1,000th time. Because that is not the point of what happens to sin in your life. The point is that you keep turning to God for correction. And hopefully, you also grow to the point where that is no longer a burden because the choices you made keep moving you away from. You step up a little higher on the platform so your feet aren't in the creek anymore. And you're still in the middle ground and you've got the choices. But what happens is you move closer to Jesus, you become more like Jesus, then those temptations do ease. But be aware, whatever your biggest temptations are, they're always going to be in the darkness, hidden in your life, and a danger to you. Because that's the trap that we allow to steal us back. So you want to be on a positive path, not just following the flow that leads you to sin and death. You want to go on the track that leads you upward toward the promises of God in Jesus. Let me read you something else somebody else said one time that I have no idea where it came from. I just found it and I said, okay. I said, watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become character. Watch your character, it becomes your destiny. All glory be to God.